Most people think capitalism has always existed. Buying, selling, private property, markets operating freely. But what if the system you were taught was natural, actually required centuries of violence to create? What if land wasn't always bought and sold? What if labor wasn't always a commodity? What if people once survived without selling themselves by the hour? Historians searched for societies that naturally evolved into capitalist markets. They found something else entirely. Feudalism didn't peacefully transform into capitalism. It was destroyed, violently, systematically, through theft so massive it rewrote civilization itself. Welcome to the economics of power. Nothing about how we live was inevitable. For centuries, people lived under systems economists now call feudalism. Not perfect systems, not romantic utopias, but systems organized on completely different principles than capitalism. Land couldn't be bought or sold freely. Labor wasn't primarily wage-based. Markets existed but remained embedded in social relationships. Then something changed. Between roughly 1400 and 1800, Europe underwent a transformation so violent, so total, that it destroyed the foundations of medieval life. This wasn't evolution. It wasn't progress, discovering its natural course. It was what Karl Marx called primitive accumulation. Understanding how capitalism actually emerged reveals uncomfortable truths about the system we inhabit today. Under feudalism, land operated through a complex web of obligations, not outright ownership. The king theoretically owned all land, granting it to nobles in exchange for military service. Nobles granted portions to vassals. Peasants held customary rights to farm plots and access commons. These weren't contracts you could sell. They were relationships embedded in social hierarchy. A peasant family might farm the same strips of land for generations, not because they owned it, but because custom guaranteed their use. The lord couldn't simply evict them to raise sheep. Law and tradition constrained what landowners could do. Property meant something fundamentally different. Crucially, peasants had access to commons. Vast tracts of land, forests, pastures, wetlands, heaths, remained available for communal use. Families gathered firewood, grazed livestock, hunted game, collected peat for fuel, harvested wild foods. These common rights were legal entitlements, not charity. For cottagers with only an acre or two of poor land, commons access meant survival. You didn't need to own productive land to live. You needed recognized standing in the community. The commons provided the margin between subsistence and starvation. They buffered against failed harvests. They made peasant independence possible within feudal hierarchy. Then they were stolen. Enclosure was the mechanism. Starting seriously in the 1500s, accelerating through the 18th century, landlords fenced off common land and converted it to private property. They had various justifications: efficiency, progress, agricultural improvement, better sheep pastures for the growing wool trade. But the result was straightforward. Land that sustained communities for centuries became exclusive private property. Forests where peasants gathered fuel became private hunting parks. Pastures where families grazed cows became consolidated sheep farms. Marshes where cottagers cut peat were drained for private agriculture. The transformation was comprehensive, and it destroyed the material basis of peasant life. The enclosures happened through legal mechanisms that made them appear legitimate. Parliament passed thousands of enclosure acts, authorizing privatization of specific commons. Between 1760 and 1870 alone, over 7 million acres were enclosed through approximately 4,000 separate acts. Landowners controlled Parliament. They wrote laws that served their interests. Common rights holders theoretically received compensation, but often poor quality land in insufficient quantities. Cottagers with informal customary rights frequently received nothing. Legal process masked systematic theft. Private property and land, the idea that one person could possess all rights to land excluding everyone else, was a modern invention, forced through political power. People resisted, constantly. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 included enclosure grievances. Jack Cade's rebellion in 1450 centered on land rights. Cate's rebellion in 1549 was explicitly anti-enclosure. The Captain Pouch revolts of 1604 through 1607 saw peasants leveling fences and filling ditches. Groups called themselves levelers and diggers, literally describing their actions against enclosure. Authorities responded with massacre, literally describing their actions against enclosure. After the 1632 Western Rising against forest privatization, leaders were hanged and quartered, their bodies displayed as warnings. Enclosure was written, as Marx noted, in letters of blood and fire. This wasn't peaceful evolution. The social consequences were devastating. Historian Gilbert Slater observed that in open-field villages, the entirely landless laborer was scarcely to be found. After enclosure, landlessness became widespread. Families who had survived for generations suddenly had no means of subsistence. They couldn't farm without land, they couldn't gather fuel without commons access, they couldn't graze animals without pasture rights. The choice became stark: accept wage labor for landowners, or migrate to cities seeking industrial work. Either way, people who once maintained independence through communal resources became dependent on selling their labor to survive. This was the creation of the working class. Labor itself transformed. Under feudalism, peasants owed labor obligations to lords. Harsh, certainly. Exploitative, undoubtedly, but fundamentally different from wage labor. You worked specific days that required tasks. The rest of your time was your own, devoted to your family's plot and commons use. Wages existed, but weren't the primary way most people survived. After Enclosure, labor became a commodity. People worked full-time for wages because they owned no land. Their labor time became something purchased by the hour, the day, the week. They became, in Marx's phrase, free in a double sense, free from feudal bonds, but also free from means of production. This transformation didn't just happen in the countryside. Cities swelled with displaced rural populations. Landless peasants became urban workers. Between 1800 and 1900, London's population exploded from under 1 million to over 6 million. Manchester, Birmingham, Sheffield grew from towns to industrial centers. These workers had no choice but to accept factory conditions: 16-hour days, child labor, dangerous machinery, starvation wages, because the alternative was literal starvation. Marx called this primitive accumulation because it created the preconditions for capitalist production. Factories needed workers. Enclosure created them by destroying alternatives to wage labor. Violence produced the working class. Karl Polanyi analyzed this transformation in The Great Transformation. He argued that treating land and labor as commodities was unprecedented and destructive. For most of human history, economic life was embedded in social relationships, governed by reciprocity, redistribution, and custom. Markets existed but operated within social constraints. Capitalism disembedded the economy from society. It made land and labor what Polanyi called fictitious commodities because they weren't originally produced for sale, subject to market forces. This created the self-regulating market, which Polanyi believed was unsustainable because it destroyed the social fabric necessary for civilization to function. The enclosures demonstrate something crucial. Private property in land isn't natural. For most of English history, absolute private ownership, the idea one person controls all uses of land excluding others, was literally inconceivable to medieval peasants and tribespeople. Land was managed through overlapping customary rights and obligations. The lord had certain rights. The peasant had others. The community had collective claims. No single person possessed total control. Creating absolute private property required destroying these customary arrangements. It required legal transformation backed by state violence. The free market in land was politically constructed through systematic dispossession. Nature had nothing to do with it. Defenders of enclosure claimed it was necessary for agricultural improvement. Private owners would innovate, efficiency would increase, productivity would rise. Some of this was true. Enclosed farms did adopt new techniques. Crop yields increased. But this misses the point. The question isn't whether capitalism is more productive than feudalism. The question is what was lost, and at whose expense? Thousands of families lost their means of independent subsistence. Villages disappeared entirely. Common rights that sustained communities for centuries were extinguished overnight. Agricultural productivity rose, while rural populations faced dispossession, poverty, and forced migration. Progress for whom? Efficiency measured how? The process extended far beyond England. European colonialism represented primitive accumulation on a global scale. Indigenous peoples worldwide lost access to land through mechanisms remarkably similar to English enclosures. Colonial governments declared unused land managed through indigenous common systems, to be crown property available for appropriation. Native populations suddenly required permission to hunt, gather, or graze on territories they'd managed for millennia. Forced into wage labor on plantations, mines, or settler farms, colonized peoples experienced exactly what English peasants had endured. Their social systems were destroyed to create workers and markets for European capitalism. The slave trade formed another dimension of primitive accumulation. Marx noted that Liverpool grew fat on slavery, calling it their method of primitive accumulation. Between 1690 and 1721, British slave trading exploded. Enslaved Africans provided labor for Caribbean sugar plantations and American cotton fields, generating enormous wealth that flowed back to Britain, financing industrial development. Slavery didn't represent some pre-capitalist holdover. It was integral to capitalism's emergence. The cotton that powered British textile mills came from plantations worked by enslaved people. Primitive accumulation wasn't just about European peasants. It was global, racial, and horrifically violent. What makes this history uncomfortable is its implications. If capitalism required violent dispossession to emerge, if it wasn't natural evolution but political construction through force, then capitalism isn't inevitable. The systems we inhabit were created through specific historical processes involving specific political decisions and specific deployments of violence. Different decisions would have produced different outcomes. When defenders argue capitalism is human nature, they're making the same error as economists who claimed barter naturally preceded money. They're universalizing one particular historical arrangement and pretending it was inevitable. But inevitability is just another word for saying resistance was futile. History says otherwise. Society worked before capitalism through complex customary relationships governing land, labor, and production. Not ideal systems, not egalitarian paradises, but systems organized on fundamentally different principles than commodity markets. Capitalism emerged through the violent destruction of these arrangements. Enclosure dispossessed peasants of commons. Colonialism dispossessed indigenous peoples of territories. Slavery commodified human beings themselves. This created the preconditions for capitalist production. Landless workers, tradable property, mobile capital. Understanding this history doesn't determine what system we should have, but it destroys the claim that current arrangements are natural or inevitable. Every system was built, every system can be rebuilt differently,